Hello, everyone. This is Dan Liebenson, and I'm here again with B'nai Lappi for the next episode of the Oral Talmud. And B'nai, it's great to be here with you again. We're going to continue our conversation about protest in the Talmudic tradition. And it, of course, connects to what we've been talking about for the last couple of weeks in terms of everything that's going on in America today with the events that followed the murder of George Floyd and all the uprisings and protests and everything that follows from that. And this deep question about how do we think about the role that we should play in events like these. And it also, though, connects back to everything that we've been talking about throughout the whole time of the Oral Talmud and really throughout the whole time of Judaism, or we should have been talking about it at least. And so there are ways in which I would say in every way, we don't see these episodes as a break from our normal Oral Talmud shows. This is very much connected to the whole process that we've been talking about. So I'm really looking forward to getting into this with you. I wanted to see before we jump into today's text whether you had other comments that you've been thinking about between last week and this week.
Let's see. There's so many things. I'm not sure where to start, but let's get into today's text. I think they'll come up because there are a lot of resonances between this text and last week's text. What's really sitting with me from last week is sort of the refrain, whose cow is it? You know, last week, the driving event was, just to refresh people's memory, the labeling of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah as responsible for his neighbor's violation of Shabbat by the way in which he sort of treated the harness on his cow. And that cow is called Rabbi Elazar's cow. And I love this idea as a shorthand for, whose job is it to speak up? And I think it's a great potential meme, right? And something we can take from the tradition as a reminder that the primary person pointed to isn't, and wasn't in that story, isn't in this story, and maybe isn't across the board, the person who committed the wrong, but the person who doesn't speak up. That's the one who's really being called out, pointed to. That's sort of the worst offense. So I'm just loving this question that I think we should always be sitting with, which is, whose cow is it? Okay, there's a cow, but is that person's cow? Is it my cow? So right. That's what's sitting with me this week.
And I should say we got a couple of, and particularly one extraordinary email about that whole conversation. So I, at this point, don't know what are my ideas, your ideas, the email ideas. So I both apologize and acknowledge that all these ideas are seeping in, and that's very much what this is all about. So we encourage more thoughtful and amazing emails, and let's just create this whole thing together. But one of the things I think was in the email that we got that just really is sitting with me is this idea that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is one of the most important rabbis there was. He's one of the most famous, one of the most well-regarded. He's in the Haggadah of Passover, and most of the time we think of him as this great, or he was the guy that led in the 700 benches worth of students in the text that we studied earlier. And yet he is like labeled with this, Rabbi Elazar's cow, about this one time when he didn't protest against a person's violation of Shabbat. And I think that that's really a really significant piece of the whole thing, that however great you are in your life, you might screw up one time, and that time might be the time that's remembered. And by the way, it doesn't mean that your name goes down in infamy. It just means that you have this little asterisk next to your name. And if you don't want an asterisk next to your name, then you're going to have to really step up your game. And even if you're the greatest rabbi we had, and I love that.
Yeah, it's great.
So
in a little bit, he can be proud that he's kind of the poster child for this, what I think was a newish idea, or an old idea that's now being lifted up and really amplified. This idea that it's not so much the offender who's who's really, who we need to focus on, but those who remain silent.
Absolutely. So
Yeah.
so let's jump into today's text because
Okay.
it's really on that story. So this is actually this text that we're doing today. It's in the tractate Gittin, which means divorces. So it's that this is particular. Well, I mean, there are ways in which this is kind of, you could think of it as a certain kind of divorce. So, but it actually kind of comes from a diversion from that specific subject, and it connects. It's a text that comes just before, not exactly, there's something in between, but almost just before the story that was the first story that we explored on this show, which was the story of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai being smuggled out of Jerusalem in a coffin, and by the way, representative potentially of the death of the previous form of Judaism, and then going to Vespasian and asking for Yavne, which is kind of where that baby Judaism is being incubated, right? That place where the sages all gathered outside of Jerusalem to reimagine Judaism. And this story is basically there as like the pre-story. It's like, well, why was Jerusalem destroyed in the first place? And you could say, well, because the Roman army was extremely powerful and they basically defeated every country in the world. And, but that's not what the rabbis say, right? The rabbis basically say, no. The reason why Jerusalem was destroyed because we messed up. And that's going to be the story. So should we just jump into starting?
Sure. But one thing I want to point out, which is, as I was relearning this story, it occurred to me that this is very much like the opening of one of the Law and Order shows. It's hard to say.
I had a sound effect, like boom, boom.
I know it's hard to say Law and Order right now without entering into a whole lot of commentary. But we'll put a sticky on that. But the innovation of the Law and Order format or formula was that the show, it wasn't a kind of murder mystery where you get to the murder at the end. Right, the murder happens in the opening scene,
right?
And you know the end of the story. But the whole show is about how do we figure out who did it and how are we going to prosecute that person, right? So that's really how this story begins. It begins with kind of a slogan: Jerusalem is destroyed because of these two guys, Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, or the story about Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, and then the story is the unpacking of that, which I think is, I don't know. I think it's kind of interesting. It's like, okay, there's a cow here. Where's the person with the cow in this story?
Right. So I guess before we even share the screen, we can say that, because I think there's something to discuss here, that the first line of the text that we're looking at is exactly what you said. Jerusalem was destroyed because of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. And these are names of two people. And what I really just want to point out is that there are sort of two possibilities here. One is that Bar means the son of. So conceivably, it's a guy named Kamsa and his son, Bar Kamsa. That's one way that we might understand that. And the other is that, like, I was thinking about, like, how might this, like, fall on our American ears? It's something like, Jerusalem was destroyed because of John and Johnson, or Green and Greenberg, right?
Right.
That there's some kind of confusion in the names is an important point here.
Right. And also, the storytelling like utility of saying this enormous world-changing, God exiling event, like there can be no bigger tragedy, is caused by these two guys. Like, what? Some fight? How could that possibly be? So from the outset that there's more to this story. There has to be more to this story. Jerusalem, the temple, our exile, can't have been an outgrowth of a simple fight between two people. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, let's remember that the Talmud is full of explanations for why this horrible tragedy happened. And I think that's part of what you have to do when you move from an old master story to a new master story. You have to tell a story about why that old one died. And, you talk a lot about how we need to mourn and acknowledge the things that are lost in that old story, but I think we also have to tell a story about why. And there are a number of stories about why the temple's destroyed, Jerusalem destroyed, and so on. And the one answer that kind of has had staying power is because of sinat chinam, senseless hatred. So I think we have to remember that the reader is likely to enter this story with that framework of, oh, it's because of senseless hatred that Jerusalem was destroyed. Where's the senseless hatred in this story? I think that's something that the Talmud expects you to do.
Yeah, I think that's
but
right.
It overturns that.
I think that's right. And also, I think it's worth just pointing out at this stage, and maybe we'll come back to it, maybe we won't, that there is this ancient Jewish tradition, I mean, ancient at the time of the Talmud, that understands our suffering as our own fault, right? That even though it usually has to do with some world power which has caused suffering to lots and lots of different peoples, the Torah talks about, if you don't follow the commandments, the land will vomit you out, and the after the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC, the first time, the Babylonian exile, one of the kind of innovations of Judaism was this idea that we were the reason why this happened, and also that it wasn't that our God was weaker than another God or that was defeated by another God. It's like our God did this to us, not another God defeated our God. Our God did this to us, and he did it to us. God did it to us because we were bad. And the response should be that we should figure out why we were bad, how we were bad, and not do that anymore. And then we'll be able to go back and to be restored, right? And so this is actually carrying on a long Jewish tradition of that mentality that says if something bad happened to us, we ought to look inward. And ultimately, I think what's remarkable about this story is it looks really inward, in ways that might be even more than you would have expected. So,
Yep.
Okay. So do you want to? So let's read some of the story here. So I am
Great.
going to share this on my screen, and so Jerusalem was destroyed on account of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. The place known as the King's Mountain, Jerusalem, was destroyed on the account of a rooster and a hen. Any idea what that means? Like
I actually don't, and I don't know. I want to put a sticky on it.
Okay.
Okay.
The city of Beitar was destroyed on the account of a shaft from a chariot. Okay, the city of Beitar, that means the Bar Kokhba revolt, which is 60 years or so later. So the Talmud is talking about why these destructions. Oh, sorry, I started too early because it says Jerusalem was destroyed on account of Bar Kamsa and Bar Kamsa twice. So here's the next. It says it again, right? They explain Jerusalem was destroyed on account of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa.
Right. That's where we're going to jump into our
right. That's where we're going to really go into it. This is as there was a certain man. So there was a certain man whose friend was named Kamsa, and whose enemy was named Bar Kamsa. He, the friend, the third person, once made a large feast and said to his servant, "Go bring me my friend Kamsa." The servant went and mistakenly brought him his enemy Bar Kamsa. The man who was holding the feast came and found Bar Kamsa sitting at the feast, and he said to Bar Kamsa, that man is the enemy of that man, meaning you're my enemy. Get out of here. What are you doing here? Get out of here and leave. Get up and leave. Bar Kamsa said to him, since I've already come, let me stay and I will give you money for whatever I eat and drink. Just don't, and the explanation here is just don't embarrass me by sending me out.
Yeah, it's like, and in the original Aramaic, it's like, just leave me alone. Don't do this.
Uh-huh.
This is embarrassing. Okay, I get that I was invited by mistake. You can imagine that he probably was happy that he was invited, knowing he was the enemy of the host. He was probably like, oh, wow, the host wants to do tshuva with me. He wants to repair our relationship. That's so nice. And here he is, probably feeling all optimistic. And the host comes to him and says, what are you doing here? You're my enemy. Get out of here. And he's like, okay, just please don't embarrass me in front of the whole group. I'll pay for my meal. Okay, go ahead, take it from there.
Okay. So oops. Okay, so I'm just getting it back on the screen. So just I'll give you money for what I've eaten. Just don't send me out. The host says, no, you have to leave. Bar Kamsa said to him, I'll give you money for half the feast. Just don't send me away. The host says to him, no, you have to leave. Bar Kamsa said to him, I will give you money for the entire feast. Just let me stay. And the host
Right.
said, no, you must leave.
Right. I
And
think
finally,
you're under reading the like
okay.
pleading, like please part. I mean, I'm really feeling this for Bar Kamsa. He's like, please, please. He's begging with the host to not embarrass him, and he'll do anything. I'll pay for mice. I'll pay for half the entire fee. Just please, please don't embarrass me. I'll pay for the whole thing. Just leave me alone. Let me just stay here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I mean, like, it's interesting. Like, why is that so important to him? You know, maybe it's something that we want to pick up, but you know, it's interesting.
Why is it so important to Bar Kamsa that he not be ashamed?
Yeah, yeah, and like, why is it even shaming to say that this person is not a friend? And you know, and it's like, I just wonder what sensibility that's bringing. Whether that's like a normal human sensibility, or the idea here is that we should even, you know, bend over backwards to make sure that we don't shame a person, even if it's not something that we would feel was shameful. I guess that's where I would sit with it. I would sort of say, like, well, look, I mean, how is it so shaming if somebody asked me to leave a party? Like, if I was mistakenly invited to a party and it turned out that it was being hosted by, you know, somebody I really don't like, and first of all, like, I wouldn't have come in the first place, but like, let's say that I came and he kind of said, oh, it was a mistake that you're invited. Yeah, I'd be like, okay, you know, whatever.
Yeah, I think we have to assume that this isn't a one-on-one interaction. I think we have to assume that the entire, you know, everyone there is aware of what's going on and is watching this. That's what I'm guessing. I think, especially knowing where the story is going to go, Bar Kamsa is feeling the eyes of everyone in the room on him and on the host who's threatening to kick him out. And I think he's imagining, if I get up and leave, everyone here is going to see me leave. It's not like I'm going to slip out the back door and people are going to think I'm just going to the bathroom or something. I think everyone is going to see that I've been ejected. And we know that the rabbis, I'm not sure how much, I'm not sure of the timeline of the rabbis elevating this transgression of shaming someone in public to murder. We know that they do that. They say, you know, to whiten someone's face, meaning to shame them in public so that the blood drains from their face, is akin to murder. And again, I'm not sure what the cause and effect is, if that's looking back, but regardless, it's seen as a very big deal to shame someone in public.
Right. Okay. So, so he's ultimately basically escorted out. And
yeah, escorted out, I think, is mild. The host grabs him by the shirt, grabs him by the body, and physically tosses him out.
Right.
Okay, so I think this is pretty embarrassing.
Right. And Bar Kamsa says to himself, since the sages, or the rabbis, we were going to translate, because in the original it says the rabbis.
Yeah.
Since the rabbis were sitting there and did not protest the actions of the host, and they saw that he shamed me, we should learn from it that they were content, or that they accepted what he did. Right. That so their silence equals affirmation. Right. And, which is a critical point.
Absolutely. So first, let's notice that this word protest here is the exact same word we had in last week's text.
Okay.
And all of a sudden, we are now seeing a bigger picture of who's in the room. Let's notice that, interestingly, the story doesn't begin with Kamsa threw a big banquet at which the rabbis were present. I'm not sure exactly what to make of that, but now all of a sudden we're seeing the lens zoom out as Bar Kamsa is reflecting to himself, hey, all these rabbis were there. Now we, the reader, are being clued in that, oh, there were a bunch of rabbis there and they did nothing. And either they did nothing means we can deduce that they were fine with this behavior. They saw nothing wrong with it, which is a problem. Or even worse, they knew it was wrong and were silent. And now they're holding the cow, right? In other words, that's we're not quite sure what's being pointed at, but we know that Bar Kamsa says, oh, the rabbis were there and they did nothing. And that's now being pointed at as the driver of the next part of the story. Like that's the offense here. It's interesting that Bar Kamsa doesn't point to the host as saying, you know, the moral of this story is don't shame someone.
Mm-hmm.
That's not the sin
Mm-hmm.
or the transgression being highlighted in the story. It's the folks who saw that transgression and did nothing. Okay.
Well, and I would say, like, well, two things I wanted to note about this. One is that it's not crystal clear that there was any such thing as like the rabbis at this time in history, which is the year 69, 70, something around there. It's not at all clear that it could be that there were people that were called rabbi in different, but the idea that there was like a collective of rabbis that had some role in Jewish society and Judean society, it's not at all clear that that's the case. So that's some evidence that maybe there is a retrojection happening here, where the story is written at a time when there were rabbis, when rabbis were maybe in a dominant social position, and they're kind of constructing a story where they were there and in some ways caused the destruction of Jerusalem, which is an interesting decision to make.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a story of self-critique and of distancing, I think. And I think you're right. And I never saw that in the story before, that the rabbis, I think, are the ones who saw this situation and left. We're going to see that in a minute. The rabbis being pointed at here, I think, are being shown to be these sort of proto capital R rabbis who were so in bed with the priestly class or the way of doing law that they're now being pointed at as problematic. Mm-hmm. And this brings us back to things that David Kramer brought out a number of episodes ago. I think he brought it out when we were live, that the early rabbis were not as radical as they're being read by later history to have been.
Right.
And now I'm seeing that in this story, that the rabbis being critiqued here, and we're going to see the critique fleshed out even more, are the rabbis from which the rabbis really split and became the radical rabbis that we all know and love.
Yeah. And the other point, just to reinforce, is that this really is a Rabbi Elazar's cow situation, because just like in that story last week with the woman who was violent, was it a woman? I don't know. For some reason, I think of the neighbor as a woman. I'm not sure if that was in the text or I'm just making that up. But in any event, the neighbor who let the cow out on Shabbat and with the strap around its horns and therefore violated Shabbat, that person seems to get not a free ride, because they're probably guilty. You know, I mean, they probably would be judged in a negative way. But the Talmud story seems to not care about that person at all. It only cares about Rabbi Elazar and says it was his cow because he didn't protest. And here, very much, you never hear about the host again, right? Like the host is.
That's right.
Like, you know, he did what he did. He's probably sinned. You know, he shouldn't have shamed the guy. But from now on, it's not, we don't hear about him. We only hear about the people who failed to protest or do other bad things in the story.
That's right. And the people who failed to protest are being pointed at precisely because they have influence and power in the situation and did nothing. I mean, right. I think the elements of power and influence
Uh-huh.
Are critical here.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And those are
I want to definitely put a sticky on that one, because I'm trying to think about some of the associations with what's going on today, and I want to make progress in the text, but I think that's a really important dimension that we want to bring out in some discussion.
Yeah, definitely. It gets back to the question we had last week, which was, what's your olam? What's that place that's your world where you have power and influence? And ironically, it may not be the big world. It may be your organization. It may be your community. It may be the white folk that listen to you.
Right. But I mean, I think there's also an element where,
If you're a white person and you're asking that, yeah.
Right. But there's also, I feel like, an element where it's there's some suggestion, right, that human beings do bad things. It's part of what it is to be a human being. And actually, it's not clear that the human being that did the bad thing is the most culpable in the story. Because that person is in the hotness of the reaction, and maybe in terms of the hotness of their own prejudices, and that's bad, and they shouldn't. We want to reimagine and rebuild society so that people don't have those prejudices. But maybe in certain circumstances, it's actually the bystander that is more guilty than the perpetrator. And by the way, I mean, I think it's a really interesting take on the killing of George Floyd. There was the one officer who actually had his knee on the neck, but there were 3 other officers who basically didn't do anything to stop him. And some people I've been hearing in the news are saying, oh, they were rookie cops. Some of them, what were they supposed to do? But I think this is a take that says, actually, they might be more guilty, or certainly equally guilty. And let's at least, so it's not unfair to them to hold them up in as much guilt as the person who actually did the deed, and maybe even more. I mean, there's something there that I think is not our usual way of thinking, where the bystander may be culpable, but not as culpable as the person who actually did the wrong. And this might be actually saying the bystander is more culpable.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's not fail to zoom out further to all of us who weren't screaming and in the streets and speaking out against the system where that was going on for years and years and years and years.
Right. And right. Absolutely. So let's continue.
Okay.
With the story. So the so Bar Kamsa says to himself, since the rabbis were sitting there and didn't protest the actions of the host, that means that they must have been approving of what the host did. I will therefore go and inform against them to the king, meaning I'm going to rat them out. I'm going to turn them. I'm going to actually say something untrue about them in this case, right? But so inform means to tell. What would be the right word? I don't think inform is quite the word in that we mean here.
Yeah.
I'm gonna slander them in front. I'm gonna accuse them of something. To the ruler.
Absolutely. Right? And this story has 2 halves, and we're about to enter into the second half of the story. And it's just like the Oven of Achnai story, where the first half of the story makes it really clear who the good guy is and who the bad guy is, and who's the victim and who's the perpetrator. And the second half of the story turns that around and destabilizes who you thought was good and who you thought was bad. And so in the first part of the story, Bar Kamsa is clearly the victim. And now, this wrong that was done to him and his anger over the bystanders who were silent and didn't intervene or protest, these events send him into a place that we're not going to justify, a place that's understandable, but nor is it seen to be justifiable, but we get it. He becomes an informant against the entire Jewish community. And you're right, he slanders, as we're about to see, to the emperor. He basically wants to bring down the entire Jewish world.
Yeah.
because of this event.
And I would go even slightly further, maybe a lot further than what you just said, in the sense that this is what I've been trying to say over the last couple of weeks in terms of the social contract. I have to say that I got this in a powerful way from a video that Trevor Noah did about the whole situation of of the looting and the rioting that followed the murder of George Floyd, and he was talking about the social contract and saying that if the social contract is the basic idea that we agree to live by these rules because we all agree to live by the rules. If the police aren't living by the rules, and if more importantly, the entire society isn't living by the rules vis-a-vis African Americans in this case, people of color, and more generally, then they're not really bound by the rules. And so now that doesn't mean that it's right to be looting. It doesn't mean that it's right to be slandering somebody to the authorities. But on the other hand, it's not exactly wrong. It's meaning like we hope that somebody would have an internal personal moral compass that would say, well, I don't want to do that. But it's not clear that they don't have a right to do that. It's in the sense that they've been.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, just in the sense that they've been that it's not clear that they are subject to the source of the rules. And so if you say that they're wrong to do it, what rule structure are you using to say that they did something wrong? Even if it was looting, even if it was destroying, even if it was slandering, if they have been so abused by the system, and here it was a man that was shamed, and how can we? I mean, maybe, right, if the Talmud often uses this idea called the chomer, that we learn from the easier case to the harder case, right? So if a man who was shamed can go out and slander the people, and he's ultimately not really the one held responsible, then all the more so somebody who's been, shamed and demeaned by the system for 400 years, right? So I think there's something there that again suggests that we can understand in the hotness of the pain and the hotness of the sense of that, well, this society doesn't actually, it's not there to help me, so why should I be there to help it? In fact, I want to burn it all down, and maybe I'll be better off, my people will be better off in a different way. Like you can accept that as a moral claim, and that doesn't necessarily mean people should exercise that right, but I'm not sure that it's right to say that they don't have the right.
And to focus only on that behavior, to focus only on the looting in the absence of the awareness of the other violations of the social contract is just a distortion. It's just
right.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. And what Bar Kamsa is about to do brings down the whole system.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's ambivalence in the story that we'll see as we get to the very last line about, actually, that may have been a good thing. And this whole story about the end of Jerusalem may actually be a story about how to bring down systems, or the stuff that happens when systems need to go down. And maybe let's watch for them. I don't know. I'm not sure. I may be mixing aspects of the story. I'm still in the process of figuring it out.
Yeah, and by the way, that's what we were saying at the beginning. Like, if folks are out there watching this, listening to this, help us think this through.
Yeah.
Okay, so what Bar Kamsa does is he goes and he informs to the emperor. He says, the Jews have rebelled against you. By the way, the Jews, always an interesting phraseology. The Jews have rebelled against you. The emperor said to him, who says so?
We have to know that that's not true, right? So this begins his lie. Okay, fine.
Right. They I mean, at least look, there was actually a Jewish rebellion, but like this was not it, and that's not what he's describing here, right? There were the zealots and the all those, there was actually a war going on. So but this story is not that the rabbis weren't the people who were rebelling against the Romans. But he says, the Jews have rebelled against you. The emperor says, who said so? Bar Kamsa said to him, go and test them. See if they're really loyal to you. Send them an offering to, an animal. Send them an offering to be brought in honor of the government, and see whether they'll do it, whether they'll make that sacrifice.
Okay, so let's notice, by the way, that not only Jews brought sacrifices to the temple. That's an important historical fact. The Romans also, and other non-Jews, brought sacrifices to the temple. I'm not sure what to make of that. But that's something that I've learned over the years happened, and we're seeing it right here in this story. It wasn't unusual, wouldn't have been unusual for a Roman, a non-Jew, to bring a sacrifice to the temple. Okay.
Okay, so the emperor says, by the way, the idea that any Jews were talking to the Roman emperor
right.
is absurd, right? I mean, that's obviously not actually a historical story. But so the emperor went and sent him with a 3-year-old calf. So he sends Bar Kamsa with the calf to go sacrifice at the temple.
So
and
maybe here comes another reference to Rabbi Elazar's cow. Okay,
right.
Here's somebody's cow.
Right. So Bar Kamsa is now leading this cow towards the temple, and he made a blemish on either the calf's lip or eyelid. And the bottom line here is that he, according to the Talmud, that he in some way injured the cow in a way that makes it, under Jewish law, not appropriate to offer as a sacrifice. But according to Roman law, it would have still been okay to offer as a sacrifice. That's
right.
The bottom line of what's going on here, right?
Right. He makes that cow ineligible for sacrifice, and he knows the rabbis, when they see the blemish, are going to say, we can't accept this cow as an offering. Okay.
Right, but the whole point is that a Roman would have said it was okay.
Right.
This is a place where there's a divergence between Jewish law and Roman law, and Bar Kamsa does something to the cow that makes it bad under Jewish law, good under Roman law. And so if the Jews don't sacrifice it, then ostensibly they are saying we don't really see ourselves as subject to Roman law, where we have our own rules, and we're not going to do it.
Right.
So the sages thought to sacrifice the cow in order to maintain peace with the government, right? So they had a conversation. The rabbis had a conversation. Well, maybe we should say that the sacrifice is okay anyway, even though it's technically not okay. But we know we're going to have trouble with the authorities if we don't sacrifice it. So maybe we should just do it anyway. Out of a sense of, in Jewish law today, people are familiar with this idea of pikuach nefesh, the idea that to save a life, you can violate the letter of the law in certain cases. And they're suggesting that, this is like a big pikuach nefesh, because if we don't sacrifice this animal right now, we might all die.
Which makes a lot of sense, and that's their first impulse. And by the way, the sort of canonization of that idea of pikuach nefesh probably is not yet in place. We know that the rabbis met in secret in an attic to sort of bring that into the tradition, but probably part of this setting is one in which that kind of svaraitic impulse, the impulse to kind of use your common sense to say, we think we have the right to put life over adherence to the law. That wasn't kind of extant and accepted at this point. And even though that was their first impulse, go ahead.
Okay.
That gets knocked down.
Right. So that was their first idea, like maybe we should do it anyway. And then Rabbi Zechariah ben Kolas said to them, if we do that, then people will say that we can sacrifice blemished animals. So, it's the slippery slope argument. If we allow it in this case, people are going to want to do it in every case. And then before you know it, everybody's going to be bringing blemished animals to be sacrificed.
For me, this is the moment in the text where you have to burst out laughing, because the story becomes a Chelm story. This Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkulus becomes a Chelm guy. Okay, so Chelm stories are these stories about, this fictitious town of fools. Of course, there is a real Chelm in real life, but we'll leave that aside for a minute. And the stories are humorous because they're people who do things that are logical but nonsensical, right? They, they have these dilemmas where they do things that are ridiculous even though in some way logical. So here comes Rabbi, what's his name? Azari ben Avkulus?
Zachariah.
Zachariah?
Zachariah, which is, by the way, means to remember, so we should remember his name. I wonder if that's intentional.
That's good. So he's like, no. If we sacrifice this animal, which everyone said, I don't know about everyone, but some of the other rabbis said, will save us. We'll save the temple. We'll save Jerusalem. We'll save all of our lives. Oh, no. God forbid. If we do that, people will think that the law is that it's okay to sacrifice a cow with a blemish on its lip. It's ridiculous. It's absolutely laughable.
What's interesting, actually, is ridiculous on another level, because there's also, right, this concept of Yehareg ve'al ya'avor, meaning there are certain laws that you should be killed before you would violate. And these are like the most important laws. Don't kill another person, even if you would be killed, because, this also might be later. But the idea that here they're saying, like, we should all be killed. Like, we should let the Romans kill destroy our entire society, because the alternative is that we're not killed, but we're going to be around, but sacrificing blemished cows, right?
Right, that blemished cows, God forbid, might actually, it's outrageous. And for me, that's what jumped out at me relearning this story for today was, oh my God, this is the last final gasping moment of the early proto-rabbinic fundamentalist way of doing law and the birth story of Svara. It's the birth, not Svara the yeshiva, Svara the concept. The idea that we have to have common sense and the concern for life and the reduction of suffering be the driver of everything we do and how we understand law. And I think this is a snapshot of what it was like before that was a native part of the system.
Right, and actually, it reminds me, early on in the show, when we talked about the mountain being held over the heads, I was bringing in some of my concepts from contract law in American contract law, Anglo-American contract law, contract under duress and ratifications. There's actually, in statutory interpretation, there's a statutory interpretation concept that says, if the interpretation that we're giving this statute would lead to absurd results, then it's the wrong interpretation. And this would be a basic case that says, like, of course, this can't be the right thing to do if it means that our society is going to be destroyed. And you're saying that the reason why we don't want it to be destroyed is because then people are going to go down the slippery slope and bring the wrong kind of sacrifices. There's got to be a different way to prevent people from bringing the wrong kind of sacrifices other than destroying our entire country and society, right? That's
exactly. And I don't even think there's a slippery slope here. There's a little tiny step. It's not a slope. It's not, this will eventually happen. This will precisely happen.
It's also not really even a good slippery slope argument, because the slippery slope argument tends to be that you start with the easy case and then you slide down towards the hard cases. Here you're starting with the hardest cases. Like, wait, so that you're arguing that the slippery slope is because we are going to sacrifice one blemished animal in order to save our entire society from the Romans, the most powerful army in the world. Therefore, some farmer in the Galilee is going to decide that he can bring a blemished cow in order to apologize for breaking Shabbat. Like, that is not a slippery slope. Like, that is an absurdist version of the slippery slope.
Yeah.
Just like you say, like a Chelm version of the slippery slope.
Right. It's ridiculous. And it's a kind of parody. It's a parody or a caricature of how the rabbis or some small proto group of rabbis were doing Jewish law. And let's remember that this is their new system, but it seems to be so fundamentalist, or they're doing it in such a tight manner that it's ridiculous.
And I want to suggest that if this story was actually constructed in the 4th century, 5th century, that really the parody, it's a Romana clef. It's like a parody. There's something going on in their society in the 4th, 5th century that is gotten to a point where this Jewish law has become so absurd. We can recognize that in our time today. That some of the ways in which Jewish law is being done in our world is so crazy that of course you would want to make a story about how that kind of thinking led to the destruction of Jerusalem. And the upshot of that is like, let's not do that again today. And the story may or may not have any real historical antecedents, but what the real interesting thing is that I think somebody in those later centuries was saying, let this story cause the destruction of Jerusalem. Let's not do it in our time about like the violation of Shabbat, right? Or like smaller matters.
That's right. As you know, I'm obsessed with Leon Kastnow, who you turned me on to, and his idea that stories are not about what happened, but what always happens, just changes the way I read every story now. So what if this story is not about how Jerusalem was destroyed, but how every system is destroyed, how every system falls, and what are the contributing factors to a system that you need to push off the cliff, essentially. And when I talk about the master story becoming fossilized and distorted and becoming just messed up as a result of many years of holding on super tightly for fear that change might happen, that's about, what happens when option 3 really needs to come about. And in this kind of fundamentalist distortion of what a legal system needs to do, I think we are seeing happening right now. It's like, oh yeah, check. Yeah, that's happening. That's happening. I think we're there.
Right.
Okay.
Let's keep reading so we get through the story and then have a little more time to make some connections to our times. So Zechariah ben Avkalos says, don't do that because it'll cause a slippery slope. Other rabbis say
I don't think it's a slippery slope.
Right. No,
whatever.
Saying, but yes, I agree with you.
It'll cause this horrible outcome.
Causes horrible outcome.
Of people thinking that they could bring a sacrifice of an animal with a blemish. God forbid. Right. Okay.
Right. So then the rabbis are worried that, okay, but if we don't sacrifice this cow, Bar Kamsa will go and tell the Roman authorities, and so then we're going to be in big trouble. So they say, well, maybe we should kill Bar Kamsa. And Rabbi Zechariah says to them, if you kill Bar Kamsa, people will say that anyone who makes a blemish on a sacrificial animal should be killed.
Right. Okay.
So another chelm.
Exactly. So let's not forget that the idea that an informant to the non-Jewish authorities is subject to death is actually, that was understandable. That for them, that was a reasonable thing to do. It's like, I don't know, you know better about American law, espionage and right.
That's why espionage is so carefully described in the Constitution, to make sure that nobody is given a death penalty or something of that nature for something that's less than what we really are trying to get at here, which is the absolute, a time of war where you damage the country, towards an enemy, in a time of war, because the penalty is so severe in the.
Right. But for them, I think what the rabbis are saying is that this is about to be a time of war, if it isn't already, right? And it actually is a reasonable thing to entertain, namely that we should kill Bar Kamsa for being about to trigger this war where we'll all be killed.
Right. But instead of engaging with that to say, maybe we should, maybe we shouldn't, this Zechariah ben Avkalos says the reason why we shouldn't do it is because then those random people who were going to go down the false slippery slope and say that because we sacrificed the wrong animal and save ourselves from the Romans, we can do it, for some small matter, are going to say, now we can kill people for small matters like, blemishing a cow, where it would be obvious to everybody that the reason why this guy's being killed is because he's a traitor. Why is this guy thinking that everybody's going to think that he's being killed because he blemished a cow? But so somehow, so then they do. So basically, but the point here also is that Zechariah ben Avkalos basically creates an absolute trap of a situation, right? We can't sacrifice the cow because then people will have this absurdist thing, and we can't decide not to sacrifice the cow and kill the guy before he tells the Romans because people will have some other absurd thing. So we're stuck. So we're going to have to not sacrifice the cow. The Romans are going to find out, destroy our society. What can we do?
Yeah,
You know?
right. It's like I guess yeah. So now here again is another episode of the story where these proto, I keep wanting not to, I want to distance, because I love the rabbis. I love them a lot.
Right.
And I want to distance the rabbis whom I love from these guys who are being absolutely ridiculous and conceding to Zechariah ben Avkulis and go, oh, okay, you're right. So we won't sacrifice the cow. We'll leave Bar Kamsa alone. And we know that that's going to result in the Romans thinking that we're revolting against them. And it does. And Jerusalem is destroyed. The temple is destroyed. Everyone is exiled. And yeah, it's kind of ridiculous. Okay,
right.
then we get the postscript.
Right, we get the sort of the final punchline. So Rabbi Yochanan says,
yeah,
the excessive humility, I don't know if you think that's a good translation, the meekness of, right?
Yeah, it maybe wimpiness, you know, and I want to give a nod to Jeffrey Rubenstein, who does a beautiful treatment of this story in his book. What's it called here? Talmudic Stories. And he says wimpiness is probably a better translation. I think he's right. It's like he points out that this word meekness or humility everywhere else in the Talmud is seen as a good thing. And this is the one time in all of rabbinic literature where it's being pointed out as the wrong time and the wrong place to be that. And I think it's interesting that it's, you know, there are qualities and character traits that are important most of the time, and sometimes you got to suppress them. Sometimes it's actually right to be something else and not cautious and not careful and not, oh, God forbid, but to be bold and courageous and take a chance and color outside of the lines, to do something which is outside of the narrow understanding of what's right today. So yeah, it's, yeah.
No, so just the wimpiness of the wimpiness of Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkulis destroyed our temple, burned our sanctuary, and exiled us from our land. That's just that's the last line in this story, right? So just to finish the sentence, so let's go back to, so by the way, it's the same word that says that's said about Moses, right? That he's the most modest man in the world, right? That it's the same word here. So whatever that word is, modest, humble, or wimpy, you know, or maybe. Right.
And it's the same word used to describe Hillel. Why, when Hillel and Shammai disagree and, you know, the heavenly voice says they're both right, why is it that we follow Hillel? Because he was this. He, you know, he was humble and a number of other things, but this word is used there as well. But here it's pointed out that being that way in this circumstance at this time is wrong. And this inability to see the bigger picture, to use your common sense or your sense of you know, maybe compassion or of politics is being pointed out as, you know, the real sin here, as well as the rabbis who go along with him. It's another one of those lacking, you know, the failure to protest.
Right. I mean, like, actually, like, I'm thinking a little bit about where's the failure to protest in the second story. And I feel like this would, meaning the second story being the Zechariah ben Avkulis material, I almost feel like the consistent telling of the story that would go along with Rabbi Elazar's cow would be one where Zechariah ben Avkulis isn't actually the villain of the story. The villain of the story is the other rabbis who didn't say this is ridiculous. You know, we're not doing that.
I agree completely, which is why this time when I read the story, I actually mistook this last line, Rabbi Yochanan, for Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. And whether it's Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai or a different rabbi, I understood the story we're reading today as being that last straw story, which propels Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai to say, you know what, this particular group of rabbis, the way we're doing things right now, it's hopeless. And I'm out of here. I and a couple of other of my colleagues who want to be in legal reform and be more radical rereaders of the tradition we just need to take this project out of here. And they leave. And I just understand now these rabbis as the ones who were the first ones out of the gate. And I think it's part of the deal that, when you're the pioneer, I remember Anna Quinlan, who was a feminist columnist and journalist, saying once that pioneers tend to be conservative. And that's counterintuitive, right? You think pioneers are the ones who are revolutionaries and they're the ones breaking out. But the early folks, and this is true, as much as I hate to say it, for early feminist politicians and, leaders in many spheres, they need to be accepted to a certain extent and recognized by the ruling authority. So they tend to be conservative, because if they're not going to get any power. And that just may be a feature of early option threes and early systems. And I think that's what this story is about. And finally, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says, okay, great. We had a beginning of something, but now we have to take it so much further than you all are willing to take it, that we need to start over somewhere else.
Well, there's two parts of this analysis that I think are interesting. One, I don't really have evidence. I haven't really done a lot of study about this, but I'm intrigued by the idea that, as we've talked about before, Rava is the hero of the Talmud. This is a man. His name wasn't Rava. That's a title. It means the rabbi, the Rav. And when your name is the Rav, that means you're pretty much the hero of the story. And so what's interesting about Rava is that there were these two great academies in Babylonia called Sura and Pumbedita. And Rava goes to this place called Mechoza and starts sort of his own place. Is my understanding of what happens there. And I wonder whether Rava is the Yochanan ben Zakkai of reality, right? Meaning that whether there was actually something had gone wrong in Sura and Pumbedita, that they had become these like absurdist, Chelm-like, obsessive, halachic, just folk just stuck in the details of it. And Rava was there for a while and tried to fix it and ended up couldn't. And then, he left and started this new thing in Mechoza. And in some way, this story and also the Yochanan ben Zakkai story, like these are stories that are actually retrojecting a similar experience back to the origin and saying, see, what we did is just like what they did 400 years ago, 300 years ago, whatever, and 200, whatever it was. And that's what you have to do. The time's come, because honestly, that's what we're doing right now. We're saying like, this seems like another one of those times where we got to sort of start over, whether we're talking about Judaism or America or the world, and it actually does feel really great to us to be able to point to these old stories and say, look, there's precedent for this. Our tradition says that this is what we should do. We're not being lawless rebels. We're actually, this is a cycle that happens in Judaism and we're embracing it. So there's that piece that I'm interested in. That's our, long-term thread for the Oral Talmud. And then there's this more recent thread of the protest, and the role and duty of bystanders. And I don't want that to get lost in what I think is also critical, which is this bigger story that we're exploring all the time, which is how much this story places the blame for these terrible events that occur on the people who failed to protest rather than on the people who precipitated the actions.
Yeah, I think it's a beautiful.
No, or I was just saying, or in the case of Zachariah ben Avkal, it's not necessarily the person who failed to protest, but the person who sort of failed to interpret the situation properly. But again, wasn't the primary driver of the action that sort of caused the situation.
Yeah. I think that's a beautiful analysis, and we know that Rava is the one who expands the notion of svara, of using your moral intuition that is informed by your life experience to shape and drive the norms that create our system. And I think this is a kind of caricature of what happens when svara is out of the equation, right? Zachariah ben Avkolus is like the picture of what you would do if svara weren't let in the room.
And just to clarify, like, svara is moral intuition. It means it really is that idea of an interpretation that leads to absurd results can't be the right interpretation. It's saying, and absurd results are not necessarily defined. It's saying an absurd result is where you feel in your gut like this is absurd, right? That's svara. That's the deep-seated sense of wrongness.
And there's something about this story which points out the falsity of imagining that the failure of the system is because of this single event. It's not this single event.
Mm-hmm.
It's not actually about George Floyd. George Floyd is this moment of realizing,
Mm-hmm.
you know, that what's wrong with the system,
Mm-hmm.
you know?
Mm-hmm.
Like as Dr. Phil always says, it's not about the doily, you know, it's not about this thing you're fighting about. It's the deep problem in your relationship that makes the doily a problem that you're fighting about, right?
Well,
It's good.
Right. No, just the fact that the rabbis in the story stood idly by when this man was shamed. It's not about the fact that they stood idly by when this man was shamed. It's about the fact that they were so low in their moral intuition, their svara, that why should they be in charge? You know, meaning like it's symbolic of the failure of society. It's not itself the reason, you know, and so it's interesting though that then it says that Jerusalem was destroyed because of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, because that's actually not correct. It was destroyed because of the moral failure of the society that predated the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. That was only the last domino that fell that caused the final thing.
That's right.
Which feels very right to today.
It does.
So our time is up, but our thinking is not. So we'll pick this up, not necessarily directly, but I think that these two texts are going to inform a lot of our thinking going forward, and we'll be back next week with another meaty episode from the Talmud.
So fun. Thank you, Dan.
See you then. Bye.
Okay. Bye.